really nice to see some people out here that are interested in history. For those few of you that know me, I'm sort of a closet historian. I'm working on my dissertation at this time on some historic topics, and one of them, part of it is the development of women. And my life with Dorothea was very, very unique. But I found that my encounters with her weren't very different than others who spent lots of time with Dorothea. For example, I first met Dorothea during a very dark time when I was going through a divorce after 27 years of marriage. Very scary, never lived on my own, and I moved into Trenton Place, next door to this place that I couldn't quite describe. It was a farm in the middle of the city. Now, I was a Wycliffe girl. I grew up there. I never really gave it much thought, what it was or what it was about. But I found myself in my sad times walking over to the fence and petting the little lambs or just staring, wondering. And then I would see this little hunched over figure meandering about. Pretty much the same time every day, because I'm an early riser. So if I was out there at 5:30 or 6 in the morning, she would be out there doing whatever it was she was doing. I had no idea. And I decided I would try to talk to her to find out what this was about. And I started to have conversations with her. Never in my life did I ever dream that it would become what it did. Being a nurse, I'm very concerned with the human condition and health and all of those sorts of things. Now, how many here actually knew Dorothea? Would you raise your hands, or just myths? Or have you ever been on her property speaking with her face to face? Okay, so you kind of know where I'm.
Mic up just a little bit.
Is that a little bit better? Is that okay?
A little bit more.
How about that? Okay, I could speak louder. I was just being nice. But anyway. Concerned about the health conditions that she was living under, sanitation first came to my mind, that things needed a little tidying up. At that time, I hadn't been in her home. I had only seen the car. And I'm sure those of you who know who she was knew a lot about the car that was sitting in her driveway that she drove, and didn't have tickets or any kinds of problems or accidents or anything like that, by the grace of God. Anyway, as I got to know Dorothea and become more concerned about hygiene and cleanliness and things like that, I was actually invited into her home, and I did spend time in her home. And what I was concerned about is the things that I saw. I saw no means for cooking at all, zero. I saw no means of refrigeration, nothing. And I wanted to know how she existed. And then I decided I would make it my mission to learn about that. And to be very honest with you, that process changed me for the rest of my life. I will always believe that everyone has the right to live as they wish, and that everybody has selections that we get to make that have nothing to do with anyone else. So that brings us to the point of getting to know Dorothea. First of all, I will say to you, she detested the name Sheep Lady. It made her cry. And she said to me, "I am not a sheep, I am a woman. I am a shepherdess." So I kind of opened my eyes. I never thought that it would be an offensive term. So I started asking her things about the sheep, and I started asking things about her. And what I learned from her is that her roots were very, very important. Hence, this will be the presentation that I will give you. She wanted people to know who her family was, where they came from, and how it made her who she was at the time we all knew her before her passing. And she knew I was a writer. I've written some books and things. As a matter of fact, one of my last books I actually dedicated to her on her 90th birthday. And she used to call me Little Druid. And I'll explain that in the thing. It was her thing. She was, I don't want to call her a mystic, but she had a lot of spiritual qualities about her. And if you ever wanted to know about somebody communicating with the land and nature and whatever powers that be, she could do it. She really could, and I saw it. And it was a marvelous, marvelous experience. But she asked me then, well, I first told her she should write a story. And she says, oh no, little Druid, I can't write. I received rejection letters. I have them. She actually gave them to me. She says, but little Druid, I want you to write the biography. And she had started then giving me papers and things that I sort of neatly tucked away in boxes, because who's got time right now, right? Okay, so let's get started. First slide, Tracy. Let's talk a little bit just about family history. Next slide, please. The bloodlines. As you can see from the screen, I've got these little colored boxes up here. The sort of grayish blue side, that was the paternal side of the family, as you can see with the name Davis. Very English, very Scottish. Believe it or not, they were directly related to Inverness Castle, the Duke of Argyll. As a matter of fact, the 16th Duke of Argyll just recently passed away within the last year or so. His family, the father's family, actually came and lived in New York for a while, and then they moved to Vermilion, Ohio, where they settled for many years until the son, Cyrus Nelson Davis, which we'll talk about in a few moments, it was the original one who came to Willoughby. On the other side of the family, we have the Marzells and the Millers, or otherwise spelled Mueller, because they were very German, very, very European, very set in their ways. And then, of course, their progeny, Maynard Nelson Davis and Elizabeth Dorothea Davis, ultimately became Davis. They had 4 daughters. Now, one of the misconceptions that came out after Dorothea's passing, and I went back before I wrote this talk, so many people say, oh, this one was born here, this one was, no, they weren't. She was not born in that house. As a matter of fact, if you go back to the census records, which I actually have copies of, she was born in Euclid, okay? What you probably don't know is the farm that was in Willoughby, there was a parallel universe in Euclid, right on Green Road at Euclid Avenue, that was hidden by trees up a hill. And if you stood on the top of the hill, you could see the lake without obstruction. That's how high up it was. I never would have believed it was there, because I had been in that area many, many, many times. I'm sure most of you had. But that was where the one sister who didn't marry ultimately ended up living. And when you look at the census records, you would realize that that was the maternal home, and that had been passed down. And then the home in Willoughby was the paternal home, which had been passed down. Some of the other family names before we go on really quick here. Maybe you know some neighbors named Frischkorn or Huliston. Those were 2 family names that they married into. Or a few more that were a little more well known to you, like Osborne, Crowbaugh, and Reeve. Some other names that come up are the Peltons. Okay, now do you recognize any of those names as being the streets in our neighborhood? Yeah, see, these people were around for quite a long time. Okay, and one more. Let's talk about her dad. I mean, her father's side of the family. Sergeant Cyrus Nelson Davis. She idolized this man. He came to Willoughby after the Civil War, after he had been a prisoner in Andersonville. Actually, he was on his way home when he got captured. And he actually received his promotion to sergeant while he was in Andersonville. I've actually had the opportunity to read the diaries that he wrote. Magnificent stuff. He then married Mary Ann Campbell, and that was the union of those 2 families. They were not exceedingly wealthy, but they were not hard up either. As a matter of fact, when he moved to Willoughby first. He lived with the Pelton family before he actually married Mary Ann. And then when he married Mary Ann, that's when he bought the property in like 1882. And his business primarily was, he was a fisherman. He sold fish. Hard to believe, we didn't hear that part before. And he was also part farmer. Okay. A little bit about the property. The house was actually built in 1788, and Cyrus bought it in 1882. He bought it which it was 24 and a half acres for $3,000. And his bill was $1,000 a year. And the person that he bought it from, her name was Mary Wooden. Now I didn't do a lot of research about her yet. This is still kind of a work in process. But there were a lot of other little episodes that came up over the years. Somebody's barn's corner was on his property and this one got sued, and little things like that, neighbor kind of bickering sort of things. But ultimately the 24 and a half acre farm was very busy, very cared for, and active, as it were. A lot of natural gas wells were on the property, which they did use. There's a natural spring, which will come back to haunt us in a few moments. I'll tell you about that, and how it's sort of like still haunting them today, which doesn't really break my heart all that much. They also imported quite a few trees from England. Now, sadly, most of the trees are gone now, and I'll show you a little bit about that. But there are some things about those trees that as we go through this talk, I will explain to you. And I have a couple pictures that will just say everything for me. Let's see. Okay, next slide. What I want to show you here, this happens to be an image from Google Earth. They haven't updated it for a while, and I was very happy that they hadn't, so I've saved these pictures. There's the farm, and let me just show you something here. I've got to find the right button. Okay, this is her tract of land that she actually lived on as we knew her today. Okay, this is 13 and a half acres. This little piece over here is Trenton Place, where I was living, and this block over here, that amounts to about 11 acres. The original address was actually stop 29 and a half Euclid Avenue, Wickliffe, because that was the postal region of the time. And then later on, when they subdivided a lot of the postal areas, that's when it actually became the address that we knew her at to this time. Let me just see if there's something else on here I need to say. Anyway, Cyrus Nelson Davis died in 1922, and around that time, that's when Maynard and his wife Elizabeth moved to the farm with their already 3 daughters, and they had been living at the maternal property previous to that. And the year after Cyrus died, this tract of land right here was actually sold, and Maynard sold that for $5,000. So they made a little bit of a profit. And then there were some concerns because in 1926, the city widened the road. Does that sound a little familiar, like 615 to you? Okay. A little bit about the mom. In going through some of the stuff she gave me, I found a picture of her grandmother and grandfather. This woman was the woman that Dorothea idolized. She absolutely loved her grandmother. She called her Grandma Bass. And Dorothea claims that a lot of her wisdom came from her grandmother. So I'm happy to have found the picture. This is like around 1895. This is actually Dorothea's mother and her uncle, John Marzell and then John G. Marzell. He actually died like around, I want to say 1908. He fell off his horse. And he probably had a head injury or something because he laid in bed for about 3 days before he died. So I suspect it was some kind of a traumatic injury. Okay. So let's look at her from a lot of perspectives by which we measure all kinds of people. Let's look at Dorothea the socialite. Now, most of us knew her as somewhat reclusive and so on and so forth. Well, from the letters and cards that she gave me to archive, I have learned she didn't have 2 minutes to rub together. As soon as she graduated from high school, she went into Floristone Mather. Now, if you think back to women's history and development, like I was telling you earlier about my research, women didn't go to college. You got married and you had bunches of babies. Because all of your babies weren't going to live to adulthood, and you were expected to help keep the population going. But Dorothea didn't believe that, and neither did her parents. Very forward thinking for their time. As a matter of fact, all of their daughters went to college. Okay. She had to sit out 1 year of college because money got a little tight and she was actually turned down for financial aid, but she did go back. And she gave me the letter where they turned her down for financial aid, and she had a few words to say about that. She was asked to pledge several sororities, and she did actually then pledge the one Theta Lambda Phi. And a lot of the women in that particular sorority were associated with libraries and learning. She was an Eastern Star. She was a member of the Daughters of the Nile. Her father was a Mason. And I could associate with that. My father was a Mason, so I can understand then the family structure and the importance of that sort of fraternal association. She was also a member of Willoughby's Women's Club. Now, at the time I met her, you know, I only was with her for 8 years. She was elderly, quite elderly, in her 80s. But I went to Willoughby Women's Club with her in her sheep boots and the whole thing. And we won the centerpiece, and we did some of the luncheons, and everybody was kind of wondering if I was her secret daughter. Obviously, I'm not, but it was quite an experience to see the relationship between herself and the other women who attended these luncheons. What a microcosm. What an experience to see. To Dorothea, the most important thing was her home and family, as I mentioned, and chronicling these kinds of things. Dorothea was exceedingly devoted to her father. As the eldest daughter of 4 daughters, and with no sons anywhere near in sight, she kind of took it upon herself to dedicate herself to her dad. Sadly, her father died of a heart attack in 1949, and her world stopped, literally. It really stopped. And I saw the evidence of that in her home. I saw that in her bedroom. I saw that in the study where her father's study. And there were actually still things on her dresser from the day he died. At the time I knew her. And this is like after like 3 fires and robberies and all kinds of other things. There were still packages sitting on the bed with receipts in them that were unopened. Things that she had purchased. I couldn't quite understand all of it, but as I got to know her, I knew the value of that because I think she relived that time in her life over and over again. As a matter of fact, she told me that when her father passed away, even though she was born with brown eyes, her eyes were now green because she couldn't stop crying. Now, at the time I knew her, her eyes were green, so I didn't know her before. She didn't get along too good with Mom. But what do we know psychologically about mothers and daughters, especially the oldest daughter? If you do a little studying, you find that sometimes the oldest daughter and mother disagree a little bit when they're competing for daddy's attention. Or, you know, a power struggle after daddy passed away. Or when you're the oldest daughter and you're employed and your mother is not, and you're taking care of her and she wants you to do everything under the sun, plus all the things that you want to do. So things were a little bit rough there. Her mother died in, I think, 1971. So therefore, Dorothea was actually living in that home by herself since that time. Lost love. Did anybody ever wonder why she didn't get married? Now, other than her devotion to her father and her home and family, there was somebody. And she told me about it, and she cried when she told me. And then she stopped crying because she had rationalized what had happened. There was a young man who was going to college, and he was going to college in New York, and he was actually killed in a car accident. And I said, well, how did you feel about that? What did you do? Or did you date again? What did you do? She said, well, first of all, I want you to know that there's nobody that will ever compare to Daddy. I'm not washing any man's shirt, although he came close. And that was her way of explaining it. I actually did research some of the archives, and I did find the article with the accident listed in there. And it was a party going on in Ashtabula, and the 3 men were in the car, and 2 of them died, and 1 of them was critically injured. I'm not going to mention any names because these people are still in the community at this time. And then, of course, the promise to take care of the land. And she felt that this was her sacred charge. There just wasn't any discussion about it. Her middle years. Well, we all know about the sheep, hence the name Sheep Lady. She loved being a shepherdess. She told me that those sheep taught her more about life than she ever learned in college. She was an avid reader. She was exceedingly brilliant. She could rationalize, she could tell you anything about any politician, and believe me, she could tell you about anything about anyone in the city. It was a lot like reading the Old Testament of the Bible. She could tell you who had who, and who had who, and who had who for almost her whole life, if she wasn't already related to them in some way. As a matter of fact, around that time, towards, I want to say like after I'd been with her about 4 years or so, I was buying my first house by myself. And every house I looked at, she goes, oh, so-and-so used to live there. Oh, so-and-so used to live there. Oh, they had 3 children. That kid was a brat. On and on and on. So it was really kind of interesting about it. She got her first lamb as a pet somewhere between the age of 35 and 40. Every time you asked her, she'd tell you something just a little bit different. So, but gauging from the documents and actually some of the registration papers of the animals themselves and from the other pets, the collies and things like that, I'd say she was probably 35. That's my best guess. She started out with a registered Shropshire, but I hate to inform you that all the things that you're seeing and hearing about this large flock of registered Shropshire is absolutely not true at this point. Probably about 10 years into having this pet lamb, somebody gave her another sheep because it was lonely. Actually, I think they had an Easter pet that they wanted to get rid of, and it happened to be a boy, and hers was a girl, and the rest is history. However, there was a little bit of inbreeding going on there, so somebody else gave her a couple more to even out the gene pool. And of course, the way of animals and nature and so forth, they had some little babies running around. So the sheep when she died, I met with a lot of people and I helped to take care of the disposition of the flock. And the majority of the flock at the time they were gone were what they call baby doll sheep. And it's a different breed of sheep than Shropshires. Okay, if you had a real Shropshire now, it's probably worth about 15 to 20 grand a piece because, they're a special breed. She had a lot of registered collies too, which you can go ahead and change that. And these are just a few pictures of the collies. For those of you who might have known her, we have Laddie, Becky, and Reddy. Now, these two were very mild-tempered, 2 different types of generations of collies that she had. But Becky was a former show dog. You couldn't keep Becky out of the water. What she's standing in there just isn't some nasty puddle. That's a natural spring that happens to run along the west side of the property, probably for about, I'm going to say maybe a good ½ acre. And it sort of like occupies the land instead of houses. Go to the next one. Okay, how about Dorothea the career woman? Well, many of you know her as the former Willoughby librarian. She served in the library from about 1950 until she retired. But before that, she had another incarnation. She was a nanny. She was a nanny for 3 separate families. Right out of college, she went into one particular family. She said that the child was like exceedingly unruly and spoiled, and no matter what she did, it was like the nanny show that's on TV now. She would have been pretty good at that. Then she was with another family for about 1.5 years, but then she settled in with the Rankins, and they had 3 children. They had a boy and they had 2 girls, and the boy was the eldest, and they called her Nursey. And she has given me a box of letters and cards and things all the way into their adulthood, where they're writing, "Dear Nursey," and they would tell something that they had done. The boy grew up to become an airline pilot. He's actually probably close to retirement now. And the girls married and had families. I think one was Gertrude and one was Anne. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about Dorothea later on, as I knew her. This is Alexander. I was there for his birth. I was his midwife. Kind of by default because I happened to be the nurse, okay? Go ahead. He's only a couple days old here. The sheep that you see here, this guy here, this kind of proves that the Shropshire line was like kind of gone, because Shropshires absolutely do not have horns. And he cropped out of nowhere. I always called him Rambo. By the way, every sheep on the property had a name. She knew every single name. And I knew I was in trouble because I was starting to know them. I was starting to know them very well, unfortunately. I don't know. They really truly had names. I learned some things. It's not much different than human nature. I have up here orphans. Well, I learned what you do when you have an orphan lamb. Now, it may be distasteful. I hope to not gross anybody out, so I'll use nice words. If you find the orphan lamb, usually they're just freshly born, and the ewe has maybe forgotten or had two, like twins. So left one in the pasture and like walks away. They just like give birth and walk. Yeah, right. So what you have to do is you have to get the placenta from that lamb, or the placenta that just came from another ewe, and you place it around or on the wool of the little baby lamb, and then you push it up against the mother, and she thinks she gave birth again, and she will take that lamb in. Now, if the lamb is a day old, you have to get some milk. Do you ever milk a ewe? Let me tell you, it's kind of interesting. I learned how to get some milk from the ewe and rub it on the lamb's face. And then she smells her milk, and she says, oh, this is my kid. And she takes it. So we did that a lot. But it's sometimes hard to, figure out which placenta belongs to which ewe, and how you're going to hold them still long enough to get some milk. Because I'm a city girl. I love animals. I'm a nurse. I know a lot of things, but I didn't know nothing about birthing them sheep. For sure. Now, one of the problems that some of the lambs had, they have these little tick things, and they get in their wool. Now, we weren't frequent visitors to the vet, but I learned what to do when you found KEDS on your lambs. You sit on the old well that's covered with Grandma Bass's tombstone that was broke off and somebody brought to her house, so she put it over to cover the well. It was actually face down, and I didn't know what I was sitting on for a very long time until one day I had to open the well to get water for something, and there's Grandma Bass's tombstone. So I'm sitting on the tombstone with Dorothea, and she says, you have to grab them by the back leg, little Druid, make them fall over, and they'll play dead. Then you get them in your lap, and you go through their wool, much like you see monkeys going through each other's fur, and you pick out the KED, you put it on Grandma Bass's tombstone, and you hit it with a rock. So I learned about KEDS. I didn't really like that part of the job at all. It was kind of bad. The water and feeding, that was another issue. Sometimes, for the most part, she had money for the Timothy and the things that we needed to feed them. When things got a little bit tight, we would get dog food from like Aldi's, the big 45-pound bag dog food things. But there were a couple times when both of us were a little short of money. And so there was an old maple tree up in the front of the land, and it's still there today. And I'll show you a little bit part of it when we get to that part of the show. Where if I got up in the tree and I stood on the branch, the big bough of maple leaves would come down, and the sheep would eat all the maple leaves off the bottom of the tree. And they loved it. They were sweet. And you had to be very careful that they weren't going into the back, because it went back 2,200 feet. And you had to be careful they weren't going back to the wild cherry trees, because if they started to eat the dried cherry leaves, they would become very sick, and some of them would die. It was actually toxic for them. So part of what I did with her is when we'd walk the property, and I walked the property pretty much, like every other day. I didn't have time to do it every day like she did. And you'd break off the bottom branches or whatever you had to do, so it wasn't like right in their gnawing kind of region. And so that was some of the things that they did. And when we would get the bags of grain, because they liked certain grain, I learned how to do it so that they wouldn't rush me. Because if they saw me come into the land, one sheep could see me because they knew me, and he'd go, bah, And then you'd hear them all the way back the pasture. It was like thundering hooves. And I would have to like get up on the porch because these, and I have a picture of it. They couldn't, I had to be like really quiet when I got there because if they saw me, that was that. I represent food to them. So I learned that if I took the bag of grain and I cut just the corner off of it and put it on my shoulder and ran, they would eat this path behind me. And sometimes I did a design, I would run in a spiral, and it looked kind of cute. It was like a little parade. They'd be running around eating. And eventually they'd all be stopping to eat, so they'd all be in this little formation. And I called her Mother Druid, and we would just laugh and carry on and make up stories about what was going on, the little dance they were doing or whatever. But it was one of those amusements, but it was great fun. I wish I had a video of it today, and I'm so sorry that I didn't do that. And I added this picture in because Alexander had this bonding thing with Rambo. They were inseparable. Where one was, the other was. And it's really odd because they were both male. Okay. So let me tell you a couple stories. First of all, I'll explain this picture here. Whenever you're on a farm, or if you're ever raising animals that do any kind of breeding, there are seasons. And the seasons can be very interesting. These are essentially coming up into being yearlings. And the little ones up in the front here are rams. And what they do is they watch the adult rams butt heads like coconuts during breeding season because they're going to fight over the ewes. So the little yearlings actually mimic what the adult rams are doing. And I could be sitting over by the fence or doing something else, and I could hear that coconut sound echoing all the way through the pasture and the little guys. So these ones right now are kind of in formation eating the seeds, but they were still too busy doing the coconut thing with the head, butting each other. And when they were this size, they were very adventurous. And of course, like I said before, we didn't have a lot of money between the two of us. So a lot of times I would just save the big balls of baling twine from the hay, the Timothy hay that we fed the sheep mostly. And I had a place where I put it because I didn't want them to get tangled in it or choke themselves or, because the bales would still be wrapped when they'd be like attacking these bales. So I had this idea that we could fix the bottom of the fences and keep the baby lambs off Euclid Avenue by macrameing the bottom of the fence, and it would be like a little net. So any place where there was a big hole, I'd take a bunch of the baling twine and macrame. So one day I was very, very busy macrameing this one hole that this one little Houdini kept getting out of, and the ram came up and butted me in the rear end, and my head hit the fence post. I swear I had a head injury. I saw stars, and I'm laying there. And he was like snorting at me and stamping his feet. And I remembered back to something that my grandfather taught me about when you raise animals that are going to take over. My grandfather raised racehorses. And he said, you have to go up and you got to punch them in the nose. And I thought about it for a minute. I wondered if it would work. But I'm thinking, here, they're doing this coconut thing all the time. Damn, come here. And I punched him right in the head. Well, I had been studying karate, so it was not a totally ineffective, it hurt. But do you know something? Like an hour later, I was sitting on the stump drinking this bottle of water, and he came over and he put his head right in my lap. Dorothea said, you taught him. You taught him. The parade. The parade took place every August. That was a time when every ram had a bald head from butting heads, and every ewe had a bald rear from being mounted by every ram on the property. So we had a couple fallen logs where we had some tarps, and that was a place where the ewes could run when the parade would start, because it was breeding season. And everything was fair game. And you could always tell when breeding season started. It was August, and there was a parade. And there'd be one ewe with a bare spot on her rear side, and all these bald rams following her. And you just always knew. And then would come lambing season. Now, the earliest lamb that I dealt with was Christmas Eve, and of course, fittingly, Dorothea named it Noel. Her name was Noel. And she did pretty well. We had to keep her inside for a while because she was kind of weak. I think she was probably preterm, to be honest with you, but what do I know from sheep? And My very first experience with lambing season was quite the shock. I had just been getting over the flu, and I was living in Trenton, and Dorothea came banging on my patio door because I was on the ground floor, and she's yelling, little Druid, she's in trouble, she's in trouble. Who's in trouble? I'm throwing on my bathrobe. She says, we're having trouble. So, and then she ran back. She'd hop that fence like nothing. For those of you who knew her, she was up and over like, so I put my clothes over my pajamas, and I went running over there, and I saw what was going on. And one of the ewes was giving birth, but it was in a breech position. And I'm thinking, oh my God, what do I do? So I couldn't really think of what you did that quickly, but I could tell just from experience that there wasn't anything that was going to save the lamb. I felt everywhere on the lower half of the body, and I couldn't find a pulse. I wasn't really sure where the pulse points were, but I could kind of guess because people have legs and lambs have legs and that sort of thing, but I never found a pulse. And so I said, I told her I would figure it out, and I went back to my apartment, and I was like practically crying, and I thought, oh, well, I'll get it out. We'll do the best we can. So all I had in the house was a bottle of olive oil. Let me tell you, there's a use for olive oil. And I did have some old pairs of sample surgical gloves. That might work, so I threw the stuff in a bag, and I'm hopping over the fence, and I'm running over there, and I still couldn't do what I needed to do. So I got one of the girls from the apartment building, and I says, now I'm not trying to make you sick, but I need for you to hold her really still. So I had her hold the ewe, and I delivered the lamb. It couldn't be saved, so that was all right, but I was able to, we did save the ewe. And I said, I can't be caught like this again, and so I went, I got on the internet later that night, and I just was doing some searching, how you do. And I found a chat room with farmers from Australia. And I said, look, I'm a city girl. This happened to me. Oh, please. What do I do if she comes banging on my door again? I feel so helpless. And they said, well, usually when everything's fine, the lambs will just plop out, and you don't have to worry about anything. They take care of it. You just make sure that they do this little thing with their lips, and they pull the sack off and whatever they need to do. They said, but if they start to come out nose first, you have to push them back in. You have to reach in and get their forepaws, and you get them in a diver's position. And once you get the 2 feet coming out, it'll come right out, because the shoulders will collapse. But if not, otherwise they become very rigid and you can't deliver them. I said, oh, great, now what do I do? So they explained to me how I could make a little lasso around my fingers, and I'd have to put my hand in there and find the feet, and you put it around the feet, pull the noose, and the legs will come forward. It does work. The only thing I would say that I wished I had were gloves up to here, because all I had were the gloves up to here for people. I used to keep a lot of hand sanitizer, and I started wearing an apron every time I went over, and then I developed a midwife bag that had all these things in it, including a bottle of olive oil, baling twine, and whatever. And so we did have the joy of a couple times of lassoing the forefeet, and I can really do it. I guess I do know a little bit about birthing them sheep, but it was quite interesting. Mortuary duty, well, maybe from some of the history that you knew that there were problems at different times when the sheep would die and they need to be buried or disposed of in some way. And these sheep last maybe 8 to 10 years. They're not like a real long-living animal, maybe like a dog or a horse or something big like that. So there were some that would die, relatively unexpectedly. Let me tell you about burying a 300-pound ram. I also started keeping a supply of plastic tablecloths, because I found that if you put roll it over onto a tablecloth, you could pull it to the back of the pasture, and then you would start digging a hole, and then you would bury it. And I didn't like that part of the job at all. But, what was I going to do? She wasn't going to be doing that, and, I was starting to feel that she needed to be protected, and, if the city comes in and says, oh, you have a dead lamb laying here or a dead sheep or something, there could be some problems. So I managed to do that. And around that time was actually when I did buy a house and I moved out of Trenton Place. So I started seeing somebody that I ultimately married. And I said, gee, I have somebody I'd like you to meet. And sometimes maybe we could use a hand. Oh, by the way, how well can you dig? And then I decided I would marry him because he could dig better than me. And so he kind of took over the mortuary duty. And it was kind of interesting. I got to tell you about this one. This is Cindy. This is another one of those medical marvels that, you know, sometime I'd like to write a short story just about this sheep, this ewe. It was lambing season, and things were going really well. I didn't have any like emergency calls in the middle of the night, we're stuck, or you know, whatever. But I always did the property rounds in lambing season because you never knew if somebody would be abandoned or orphaned or, you know, who knows what. So we went and had a lammy barn about, I'd say 1/4 of the way into the property from Euclid Avenue. And lambing barns are short because they need to keep the body heat of the lambs in so you don't have to provide external heat. So when the flock goes in there, it's warm. You'll sweat even when it's cold outside. So I happened to just be making the rounds, and I looked into the lamb barn, and there was a ewe laying there. I said, oh God, not mortuary duty again. So I crawled in there, because you can't stand up, and you're crawling in like some stuff that's not like so fun, and it smelled bad. And then I heard a little rustling, and all of a sudden, a little lamb jumps up in the air and is standing on the back of the ewe. And I said, where did you come from? And I didn't want it to be near the dead ewe. So I was going to capture the lamb and take it in. And then I realized the ewe was warm. And I thought, ooh, what's going on here? And then I went around the front, and I could see that the ewe was blinking. So I called Dorothea out right away, and then I checked her udder. I was being the really good nurse, the sheep nurse, and it was full. I said, Dorothea, I don't know what's wrong with this ewe, but you know, as long as we keep feeding it and giving it water, it'll make milk, and then we could wean this baby. And it was also a baby ewe. And she says, okay, so we did that for a few days. So meanwhile, I told Marty, my friend at the time, I said, I have this ewe in this lamb barn, and I got to get her out of there because I can't do what I need to do. So he pulled her out. He says, you know what? He says, let me try something. So every day he went over there, pulled her out of the lammy barn, and he walked her. He'd get her hands under her belly, and he made her walk. And she walked again. The only thing is I think she had some kind of a neurogenic shock going on because all her wool fell out. She was bare, naked, pink after that, and except for the tuft on her head. That stayed, that didn't fall out. We never figured out why. And then she ultimately was fine and was walking around, and as you can see, it's kind of hard to tell, it's bright, but Dorothea did name the baby Cinderella because the mother's name was Cindy. And so you can see this is just before Cinderella was weaned, and Cindy was starting to get her wool back. But it was really kind of a fun story. Okay, now this is some of the stuff that hit the press, the trials and tribulations. I don't know if any of you remember back to when CEI claimed eminent domain, and they cut down 1,500 trees on her property. And they promised that they would seed or sod the pasture so that the sheep would have a place to eat. Guess what? At the time I met her, which was like 20 years after CEI did that, and they put all the power transformers through her yard, do you know the trees were still laying there? Never seeded, never sodded. The pasture was never reestablished. Until I got over there with a bunch of my friends, and I would call in some favors, and I went and I bought a bunch of $5 rakes. We raked that pasture, and we seeded it. Picked up the beer bottles and all the garbage that we could find around there that would be harmful, and we seeded the pasture with things like clover and alfalfa. And so we'd have to block part of it off because as soon as I'd put the seeds down, those little sheep would be in there picking the seeds out, eating them. You all know she had some house fires. There were 3 of them. And the first 2, I really didn't know her. And I understand that she was living in her car and then eventually moved back in. But after the second house fire is when she had encountered another person that sort of took her in. And I'll show you him in a moment. His name was Michael, and he was with her for 13 years. and he took care of her the best he could. He did all the farmhand work, he did the repairs, he fixed her car, he did those kinds of things. Something that struck me, taking you back to the beginning of this, as the nurse, the living in the car thing, I can't tell you how many times I cleaned out her car. And the first time I cleaned out her car is when I really knew I had a mission, because I think she had been eating frozen pizzas that had not been cooked. All right. In all conscience, I couldn't do that, so I started making sure that she had food. And there were other people that were helping too. I'm not like the sole angel that came in and did everything. There were so many people that helped and did things. But there were some of us that were there like all the time to make sure that it kept going. Okay. This is Michael Burke. Wonderful guy. Actually, his hair did turn white, but it used to be shocking red. Now, Michael was with her for 13 years doing all the extra work, but he also played guitar at the birthday parties, and he would come over and we'd just sit around and play guitar in the backyard or do whatever we were doing. And he did a lot of things. Like, for example, there was a special bluegrass band that came to Malarkey's in downtown Willoughby, so he'd get Dorothy all dressed up and take her out there. I think Dorothea loved him in the truest sense of the word, because there were some times when I would be bathing her or doing her hair or whatever needed to be done, and she would tell me that. And a couple times she cried and she said she didn't want to be old anymore. She wanted to be young because she'd found somebody. You know, and how do you do something with that? You really can't. But he was so very, very good. And he was another one that the sheep loved. He would stand up the bales of hay and the sheep would climb to the top and the little ones would learn how to climb, you know, and all that sort of thing. But he was absolutely number one, I think, in her life, next to Daddy. And he didn't wear shirts that you had to iron, so I think he might have been a good candidate. This is another one of those people, Sis, Cecilia Kostelik. She's a second grade teacher in Wycliffe. She was with Dorothea for probably around 10 years. And Dorothea used to take a baby lamb every year to the classroom and read stories about sheep to the kids and do some things like that. But Sis also did extra things with her. Sis took her to the theater. Sis took her to family events like weddings and parties and all of that sort of thing. And Sis's husband's name is Marty too, like my second husband's name is. And the four of us used to get over there, and we actually did remove the refrigerator that didn't work. And by the way, it was a gas refrigerator. I never knew there was a such thing. It hadn't been attached to anything for more than 30 years. So we took all of those things out of there. We remodeled the kitchen, the bathroom, and she wanted to have Daddy's den be her bedroom, so that's what we did. And I got her some quilts, made her kitchen curtains. And so Sis and Marty and my Marty and myself, we did all of those sorts of things to make it homey for her. And then there's just me with one of the sheep. I figured I better put my picture there. Sis took this picture. But I want you to look at Dorothea in this picture. This is a very natural way that a lot of people saw her. And what she's actually wearing, I mean, she's got shorts and a top on, but she wanted to dress for the occasion, so she wore a silk bed jacket. Why, I don't exactly know, but it was something she liked very much. And you'll notice she's got some keys pinned to the front of her. She kept losing her keys, so I started pinning things to her so she wouldn't lose them. I'll just give you a few memories. Dorothea's there in the pink, and she's at the Willoughby Women's Club. That's one of the luncheons that we went to, so I took her picture because told her she looked gorgeous. And up in the upper corner, that's another woman with Dorothea. Her name is Dorothy Davis, and that was a friend of my family's. Both my mother and father knew Dorothea as well. And so every Tuesday for Seniors Day, we had chili. Every Tuesday, chili. Do you know? You know, as much as I loved her, I tried to eat other foods, but after a while, I couldn't even hardly walk into Wendy's anymore because, you know, all I could think about was the chili. And, you know, So I didn't go there at any other time, but we did go there for like 4 years in a row, every Tuesday, without fail. And it was because if she paid $1, she got the senior bowl of chili, and they gave her a second bowl, unless it was too peppery, and then she wouldn't eat it. Who knows? And then down at the bottom there's Michael at her 90th birthday party. I couldn't be there. I had to be in a class myself that night. But I did call her on my cell phone because it was for that birthday that I had dedicated one of my textbooks to her. And so she was so excited because Little Druid was a writer. Okay. And she came to my wedding. And she was, I think I passed up a page here. Oh, okay, never mind. This is also one of the birthday parties for her. And she liked anything that was extremely feminine, anything that smelled good, particularly lilac, and anything that sparkled, much like a magpie. Anything that was flashy and trashy, she really liked. And so I always made sure that if I gave her something, it either had glittery ribbon or sequins or, something like that. And they were usually filled with like bath products, like, bubble bath and things like that, because we always tried to bathe her as often as we could. The first time I combed her hair out when I first met her, it took me 3 hours. And I was almost afraid. I still did it. And it was quite an experience. And so after I bought my house and I was living by myself, I started bringing her home for all the holidays at my place. So Christmas and Thanksgiving and all that, and we'd make good food. So it started to be a joke, is it something good to eat? And that was something she'd say to me all the time. And she would want to bring something, but I really didn't want her to bring something. So I would say, well, maybe you could do something for me. So I always made sure I had at least one shirt that I'd cut the button off before she got there and say, oh, the button came off, could you put this back on? And so there she is sewing the button on a jacket for me to earn her dinner. And of course, she always dressed for the occasion. She dressed in her Christmas sweater for Christmas. Okay. And then here's where she came to my wedding. And my friends all thought I was absolutely bonkers. You're having the sheep lady at your wedding? I said, yeah, she should be at the table of honor. And she's Mother Druid. And it was really, really nice because my own mother had then passed away. So Dorothea was there for me, which was wonderful. So for her Christmas present, I bought her a whole new suit and shoes. And she had some hammer toes. She had some deformed toes and things like that. And so I bought her fancy bedroom slippers instead of real shoes, and she was very happy for that. I think of all the rams that she liked the most, she liked little Gemini. And so I have a lot of pictures of her with Gemini, and he's very characteristic. You can see how, even though he was starting to get like flushed out with the wool, he had some very characteristic looks to him that really differentiated him from the other sheep. So I have a picture of her with Gemini. And that's me up at the top when it was the big baa that was heard across the pasture, and everybody came to see what Little Druid had. And I always had a pocket full of dog cookies, and they knew that. So they would come and they'd try to stick their head in my pocket and everything, and that was kind of fun. This is Rolly from Lake Farm Park. He taught me how to shear the sheep. And one thing I didn't know about these sheep is the only way you could start the clipper is if you found the bald spot in their armpit. Who knew that? And you had to be very careful because anatomically the boys and the girls were like very different. And sometimes it was very difficult to tell when they had lots of wool. So I sort of left all this up to Rolly, although he did teach me how to do it. And when they shear off the wool, they leave it in one piece and they roll it up kind of like a taco. And they set it aside so that when you put it in the bag to take it to the place that bought the wool, you'd stack them in. And let me tell you, driving down to Columbus with a bunch of bags of wool in your car is like an effluviant experience. I think the happiest moment for Dorothea was actually attending a wedding with Michael. And this happened to be the wedding of Sis's son. And I had done a spa day with Dorothea at my home, showered her, did her hair, did her nails. She looked like a beauty queen. And I knew that I had to keep this talk short, so I can't tell you everything that went on. But we spent a good 6 hours that day getting her ready to go to this wedding. And she wore a pink chiffon dress. And she said to me that she was wishing it was her wedding. And Michael came to our house and picked her up like the prom queen. Okay? It was wonderful. I was crying the whole time. It was marvelous. Okay. So let me take you to the end of the story. Go ahead. This is one of the famous trees that I wanted to tell you about. This is one of the trees that was brought from England. It's a black walnut tree. And if you'll notice at the top of the tree, there's a heart. Do you know that was a natural branch that fell out of the tree and left that mark? And I always wished in my heart of hearts that I would have had some way to cut that chunk out and keep it. Obviously, it wasn't my tree and it wasn't my choice, but that was beautiful. And the whole place was full of stuff like that. Beauty that you would normally overlook. When we lost a baby lamb, we had a special place that we buried the babies, and this is the baby cemetery. And there were many varieties of daffodils. She told me there were 50 varieties of daffodils, but I wouldn't know that for a fact. But it was also fenced in so that the animals couldn't dig it up, and also that the big lambs couldn't eat all the daffodils. And she used to tell me to go there and get myself some bulbs out of there, and I never did it, and I'm sorry that I didn't. And this is all gone too. And I often wondered, go ahead, you know, if anybody remembers the visions of the lambs standing on top of the bales of hay and standing on the side by the fence. That whole row of trees by the fence there, by the way, were pear trees. And so what we did was, if the pears just fell in the pastures, the sheep were like really happy because they liked anything sweet. If they were acting like they were off their feed, we'd go to the store and we bought bottles of maple syrup and we'd sprinkle it on the hay and to sweeten it up. And then they would eat it. But any pears that fell in the driveway here, we would gather them up and wing them over the fence. And the sheep would run after them like little dogs. It was so cute. And sometimes the collies would run after them too and catch them like a ball. Here's the natural spring now. They can't build a house there. And it doesn't really break my heart. It does run pretty far in, but I picked this picture because I had referenced that maple tree, and that's the maple tree that's right out front by Euclid Avenue. And that's the one that fed the sheep in the hard times. That tree is enormous. And right under that tree is also the third water well. And if I really got into trouble, if I could get an extension cord out there, I could sink the pump, and we had a plastic swimming pool. Well, actually, we had pails in the beginning, but then we had a child swimming pool that we could fill with water for the sheep if we had a problem. Okay. This is what's left of the basement. They actually took all the boulders. The whole basement was, the walls were actually boulders, and it was a dirt floor. And that was what's left. I actually got a couple of bricks, and I'm going to be making a rock garden, and we've called it the Druid's Rest, and we had the sign made and everything. So when I get a chance, I'll get that finished. This is what the property looks like now. Of course, the buildings are gone. The barn was made of hickory, by the way. And in the house, some of the things you wouldn't know, if you stood up in the bedroom, you could look through this one walk-in closet that was there, and there were still rows of couture dresses made in Paris from when she was a nanny, still wrapped in plastic and paper. All that was gone. And one thing I like about this one is nature still has the last word. You still got to stop. And as I was standing there when I took these pictures, it took me a really long time to be able to go back to the land. And this happened, and I said to myself, she's sort of still here somewhere. And there they go, the little parade. Last one. And last but not least, the people who bought the property, by the way, for $1,900,000. That's just the 13.5 acre parcel that was originally part of the original $3,000 piece. This is the plaque that they put up, but it makes me really sad. I guess I can live with Sheep Lady, but the birth year is wrong. She was born in 1913.